Hello and welcome to the Indo-German Business Talk, our monthly format where we talk about issues pertinent to India and Germany and Indo-German business and trade. My name is Matthias Katon. I am your host, and I'm also the Deputy Chairman and Executive Director of the Indo-German Center for Business Excellence, which is the center that runs and hosts this format. Today, we will have the last installment for 2023, so there will be no session in December. And as the last session of the year, of course, we thought it makes sense to look back a little bit on the year, what happened in 2023 with India, with Germany, and obviously also with Indo-German relations. And as usual, I'm not alone. I'm joined by an esteemed group of experts on the topic. I will introduce them in a moment. But as always, and the regular viewers know that already, we do not just want to talk among ourselves here, the panelists, but we also want to bring in you as our viewers. And we will give you several opportunities to participate and contribute by answering some questions, but also by posing questions that you might have to our panelists and guests here online. And I would like to start with a first question, actually, that I have to you, which we will open while I introduce the panelists. And that question is the following. Which sector made the biggest achievement this year in Indo-German relations? And that's a number of topics that you see there, and you can rank them, or you can select the ones that you believe made or where we made the biggest achievements in 2023. So please go to slido.com, cast your vote, and while you do that, I will introduce our panelists, beginning with Velina Chakarova. Welcome, Velina. She is joining us today from Vienna, I believe, where she is a distinguished expert in geopolitics with over 2 decades of experience. Her experience stems from her role as the former director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy and her current positions as an instructor at the Real World Risk Institute and a member of the Strategic and Security Policy Advisory Board. Velina has a strong record of providing insightful geopolitical and strategic solutions to both public and private sectors. Velina, welcome to our talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure being with you.
Same here. Next, we have Gopal Naradur joining us from India. He's the Vice President for South Asia at the Asia Group, and he brings a wealth of knowledge from his time at Harvard, the Kennedy School of Government, but also from his extensive work with Niti Aayog, a very important Indian institution, formerly known as the Planning Commission, I believe. And his experience spans across business advisory and program implementation in over 50 countries on manufacturing, infrastructure, and logistics. Gopal, also to you, warm welcome to our format.
Thank you so much for having me here. Real pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone.
And finally, with me on location physically, standing next to me is Kasturi Dade. She is the director for India, the United Kingdom, and Ireland at Frankfurt Rhein-Main GmbH, which is the inbound investment promotion agency here for the Frankfurt Rhein-Main region, where we are based in Germany. And Kasturi is an adept leader and expert in international trade, investment, and development. She has a deep passion for fostering Indo-German bilateral partnerships, and she plays a pivotal role in her function in driving investments among other regions from the Indian subcontinent into the Frankfurt Rhein-Main region. And I should also add, she has been one of the most important and strongest supporters of the Indo-German Center since its beginning. Welcome, Kasturi.
Thank you so much, Matthias. It's also a pleasure to be here.
Now, looking at a year in review is always kind of like a broad topic, so I think there will be many issues that we will look upon, but let's start a little bit with the big picture. And if we look at the globe. We've seen no scarcity of conflicts in 2023. We've had the ongoing war in Ukraine, of course, that continued. We still see heightened or maybe even rising tensions between the US and China and some of its neighbors in the South China Sea region, obviously also around the issue of Taiwan. We've now recently seen the flare-up in the conflict in the Middle East. So in that context, Velina, what do you think? Is there an increasing role for Indo-German or Indo-European partnership also when it comes to these security issues?
Oh, absolutely. And actually, it goes in both ways, of course. India-Germany relations are very, very important also for the future of the relations between the European Union and India. As we know for a fact that Germany is not only, let's say, the most important European economy, and we know for a fact that most of the trade within the European Union, it's an intra-state trade with more than 70%. So in a sense, a very, very good relationship between Germany and India. And I would argue that 2023 has been a very, very good year for the bilateral relationship, will also translate into a better relationship between the European Union and India. Here, of course, I see the biggest highlight from this year with the visit of the German Chancellor to India, which is not only a strong signal in the world of geopolitics, as we all know. These kind of relationships are also important to, build trust between the leaders of the two countries, and also, of course, to, let's say, steer the process, the political process. This is the first thing. The second thing is also the Migration and Mobility Pact. And the third thing is actually the Trade and Technology Council between the European Union and India. These are my three big highlights for this year, which I think will build the skeleton and the fundament for both the bilateral and the multilateral relationship.
Now, when we look at geopolitics that you mentioned, it seems to me that there is a kind of a mixed picture. If we look at Ukraine, many Western countries, European, but also the US, found out, some to their surprise or their dismay, that a country like India is very keen on pursuing a different path that does not align with the position of the Western countries. When it comes to China, for example, which is a different case, there seems to be much more of an alignment, and also part of the strategic importance that is, the US in particular places on India is obviously in relation to the tensions with China. So what kind of a role is there for this partnership? Is it transactional in the sense that we look at different things, and some we work together, others where we don't agree? Or is it a values-based partnership? How can we understand this increased interest in Indo-German, Indo-European relationships?
Well, in order to understand, actually, in order to develop a vision for this bilateral, but also, as I said, multilateral relationship, because it's not only about German-India relations, it's also about European Union-India relations. And I argue that this relationship will see the most successful decade of development actually since the launch. This is my prognosis, but we need to understand the geopolitical context. These are relationships that will not build first and foremost on shared values or the way how we in the West understand these concepts of strategic alliances, but at the same time, both India and Germany, and by extension the European Union, need a third way out of this dilemma of systemic rivalry between the United States and China, which actually goes already in the way of a Cold War 2.0 scenario, which neither Germany and the European Union on the one hand, nor India on the other really want to see happening. So here we have a very strong case for a third way of navigating these complex geoeconomic and geopolitical relations in this and in the next decade, where India is expected to become world's economic power number 3, and this will have serious consequences for the way how India is going to shape its relationship with Europe and other partners. But it is going to have consequences also for, as you mentioned, rightfully mentioned, the relationship with China, a very complicated relationship in terms of geopolitics when it comes to India, but it's also increasingly complicated relationship in terms of geoeconomics when it comes to Europe. Think of the de-risking approach. So here, once again, there is a common ground. Final point, it is wrong to expect that India is going to change its relationship with Russia just because we in Europe have a serious problem because of the ongoing war. This is not going to happen. India will continue to be a bridge builder and to act with both sides, on the one hand with the West, but on the other hand also within the newly emerging formats steered by China and Russia, such as BRICS, such as Shanghai Cooperation Organization. A lot is going to happen there as well. So it is actually wise on our side here in Europe, and specifically on behalf of Germany, to have a very constructive and very pragmatic relationship. So it's going to be really more about economics. Europe is in a very serious, I would even argue, precarious situation right now, with the most, let's say, serious kinetic warfare going on actually for almost 2 years now. So in a sense, geoeconomic comes first in this relationship and geopolitics comes second.
Okay, thank you very much. And before I bring in Gopal and Kasturi, I would like to go back to the question that I posed to our viewers. So if we could see what our viewers think. And there, in fact, we see that geopolitics that we've been talking about is only fifth, right? So we have business and economic issues placed first, then climate, digitalization, data, which is arguably also obviously a business-related topic. So that seems to align with what you just said. Now, Gopal, you work a lot on these issues, manufacturing, infrastructure, logistics. Do you agree with what Velina just said? Is it primarily an economic relationship that connects Germany and India?
Thanks, Matthias. Yes, I would largely agree with what Velina said. I think both sides do see the tremendous potential of the relationship, which arguably has been underperforming given relative to its potential. We know that goods trade between Germany and India was about 20-25 billion euros a year or two ago, and by comparison, if we take the U.S. Germany trades with the US 200 billion euros a year. With China, it's 250. So that's 10 times, German-India trade. Vietnam and Thailand, about 10 to 15 billion euros a year. So, given the size of both countries, given the manufacturing and innovative prowess of Germany, especially in the higher tech industries, and given India's ambitions to grow as a manufacturing base for many sectors, and happy to discuss that. There are a lot of complementarities here, and so we can also talk about why some of this potential has not been realized so far, and I can share some observations on the ground here. But going forward, there is tremendous potential there. A couple more points. One is that the unlocking of this potential could be helped by two things. One is the increased movement of skilled researchers and workers. And this is happening more from India to Germany than the other way, and I hope it happens the other way as well going forward. But we know that there were over 20,000 immigrants from India to Germany in 2021. In terms of work visas, study visas issued by Germany, India is always quite high in numbers. We've also followed Germany's, immigration policy changes recently. The people-to-people linkages growing over time can help a ton, because one of the areas that leads to this underperformance of this relationship, perhaps on the business side, is a lack of awareness of how the opposite side functions, thinks. Perhaps a lack of awareness of how to interpret the domestic context, and I think growing these ties can help quite a bit. I'll actually pause there. Happy to dive in further as helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And it's good that you highlight that, of course, bilateral trade between India and Germany dwarfs the volume that we have between Germany and China, for example. So, glass could be half full or half empty, depending on the outlook. If you look at it from, I think, the German perspective, India has always been like the country of potential, where people said, there is potential, but for some reason, it's not there yet. So my question to you would be, and maybe to add, at the same time, we've had German companies active in India for decades. I think countries like Bosch have a history that goes back 100 years and more. So it's not that there weren't any touch points. My question, why is that? And secondly, do you think that now maybe we're at a point where we will see some kind of a breakthrough in terms of growth of bilateral trade and business?
I do think so, Matthias. So to answer your question about why there's that, perhaps we haven't seen the wave of German investments and companies flooding into India as we would expect. I think, perhaps building on my earlier point, India is large and complex, and in many ways, India is not a country it's like the European Union. It's like operating in many countries in terms of domestic cultures, variation of context across states. It's a very federal government structure. Different states have quite a bit of mandate in terms of the kinds of approvals and registrations and so on that companies need to function on the ground. So there's a lot that's done at the national level, and there's a lot that's being done now. And then there are some states that are higher performing than others. But if you're looking at India from outside as a business and trying to figure out where should I start, where do I go? Which state or city do I engage with to kind of set up my facility? How do I go about the registration processes and approvals? And who do I partner with locally? Do I need a JV? Do I need can I just set up a subsidiary of my own? It can be overwhelming, and so perhaps that plays a big role in keeping German businesses so far from leaning in even more. That being said, to answer the second part of your question, yes, I do see things changing for a few reasons. One is, of course, the geopolitical context. And as Velina mentioned, there's much greater emphasis on diversifying supply chains, on de-risking supply chains. And India has emerged as one of the high potential locations for diversification. Now, why has India emerged? So there are two things there. One is just the lure of the Indian market, and we're all familiar with this. India, Velina mentioned some statistics about India at 2030, but if we look even further ahead, India at 2050 is projected to have the second largest economy in the world, 15% of global GDP, a third of the world's middle class, the largest global workforce. Even now, we're seeing spending power and consumption increasing. So the size of the domestic market itself is a big lure. Now, the second part of that is ongoing policy reforms. So we've seen over the last decade or so, I think, accelerated policy reforms, formalization, digitization of the economy through a number of measures, infrastructure, logistics. I think that's received much greater share of budget allocations in the last few years than ever before. I think it's 1.7% of GDP now, which is a record. There's incentivizing domestic manufacturing. There are a range of measures to try and make India more cost-effective and appealing. And finally, there's also accelerated negotiations towards FTAs, free trade agreements, including advanced talks with the EU, or advancing, I'll say. I don't want to celebrate too early. But, you know, FTAs have already been concluded with the UAE, an interim deal with Australia. The talks with the UK are quite advanced, and talks with the EU and EFTA and GCC are advancing. So, you know, all of this signals intent, I think, to engage with the world, to play a role in trade and global supply chain. So, you know, just summarizing, yes, I do see a lot of, you know, I see a shift in the trajectory of the relationships going forward.
And maybe just to
Yes.
add something important, especially for those who are now carefully listening to us and are maybe considering an entry. Yes, so if we actually take a look at the European Union and India, these are probably the two most regulative, strongest and most regulated actors, right? So both are famous for the love of regulations. It's very hard, of course, to enter, but once you are there, it's actually, you know, a lot of things are happening here. It is important to highlight that the very fact that after 10 years of break, the negotiations on the free and trade agreement between the European Union and India, by the way, in the hierarchy of trade agreements with the European Commission, this is the highest of all bilateral relationships, and it's much better than actually what China was being offered with CAI, with the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which is also put on hold. So in a sense, the very fact that after 10 years of break, these negotiations have been relaunched actually points already to the direction that, of course, is very much in the interest of Germany. And obviously, Germany was also part of this process. So here there are geoeconomic realities because of the global reconfiguration of supply chains, because of the reconfiguration also of global capital, specifically coming from the West, because as we know, still the North is responsible for the capital. And the global South is now becoming this arena of actually a lot of investments. So here we have India being this advocate for the global South, and a lot of this reconfiguration is going to be rerouted, if you think it in a more metaphorical way, actually towards India. So it's good to be, let's say, among the first who understand these systemic shifts and global trend projections.
Thank you. And very interesting also what you mentioned, Gopal, is that India, of course, is increasingly seen not just as a production location, maybe, you know, a place where labor costs are cheaper, but it's also becoming more and more a market where Western countries can sell their products because the economic power and well-being is rising. There's an increasing middle class with matching purchasing power. Now let's move to Kasturi, and obviously your job is not so much looking at German companies investing in India, but more the other way around, promoting Germany as, or Frankfurt, the Rhine-Main region, as a destination for inbound investment. When we look at India, do you see an uptick there in interest from Indian companies wanting to invest in Germany? And what changes do we observe here?
Okay, thank you, Matthias. Actually, in my previous job, I did look at German companies wanting to invest in India or having invested in India. And I think, you know, let me start with just something that the Indian Prime Minister said when he came into power, that India has three main highlights or three main touch points. One is demand, democracy, and demography. And I think these are the three shared values, three shared kind of commonalities between Germany and India, why these two countries need to be and act and work more together. I'm going to just refer to what Felina said and Gopal said, that the potential has always been there. The partnerships in theory have also been there for the last 22 years. India and Germany shared a strategic partnership since 2001. So the mechanism and the structure is there. And I think I'm going to add in a 4D that probably was lacking, and that was discipline. There were sporadic waves of German companies wanting to invest in India, partially also because what could not be done with China, they tried to do with India. But at the same time, in the last 5 to 6 years, ever since we've seen more German companies having their bases in India, be it for manufacturing, services, whatever, that has kind of had a ripple effect on Indian companies wanting to come to Germany. And I think that there's that healthy give and take that is happening now more than ever between the two countries. I think pandemic played a big role in why that uptick, which could have happened 4 years ago, didn't happen. But the recent statistics show that that has increasing. So while we have about 2,000 German companies having some sort of a presence in India, having some sort of an investment in India, we have around 200 Indian companies. I'm very proud to see a large part of them in the Frankfurt region, in the Frankfurt-Rhein-Main region, and about 600 Indian companies with a stake or an investment in German companies as well. So if you look at these numbers, I think that they're quite comparative. And I think they show a positive resonance between the two countries. The G20, I think, just further ushered and further kind of pushed these relations. And with 8 German ministers, I think this was the first time that the German economic minister in 10 years visited India. And that's a great, powerful message that, that both the countries are also showing. With regards to Frankfurt and the Frankfurt-Rhein-Main region where I am based, I have been here for 17 years now. And when I came to Germany, we had about 3,000 Indians, or diaspora population, 3,000 Indian passport holders living here. Today, we speak of more than 25,000. Now, I agree with Gopal that this is nothing in comparison to Indians living in the US or Indians even living in the UK for very obvious political, historical reasons. But we see that that increase is also happening in Germany consistently over the years. It is probably, you won't see an upsurge from 0 to 100, but this has increased over the years. And today, we can safely say that while Germany is the largest trading partner for India in the EU, it's the third most preferred destination for Indians after US and UK. And I think I'll leave it at that for now, Matthias.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. And this is one thing that Gopal mentioned. We have a rising number of people, skilled laborers, but also students coming from India to Germany. You said, you hope that also more Germans would move to India. I mean, part of the problem is that we don't have that many people. So we are an aging society. So we need people coming in rather than being able to send people out. But I think that's also maybe a part of the beauty that, we have two countries, one that is still a very young, growing, dynamic society such as India, and Germany being an aging society, so that might prove to be an area for
that I would agree, where the demand part, where Germany has the demand and India can supply. So I think that's a good position to be in. We have the demographics, we have a young workforce. Now we also have the immigration law, which has been revised and passed over the years. So I think if India can supply this lacuna that the overall EU is facing, I think that is a very solid base of cooperation going forward as well. So unfortunately, Gopal, we don't have that many young people to spare. So maybe we'll send some pensioners to Goa. Maybe that would be an option as well. But let's see.
They'd really enjoy it.
I'm sure they would. Before we continue, let me remind our audience that they can go to Slido, our Slido page, and ask questions. You can use a text function there. You can write in your questions, and I will then put them to our audience on your behalf. Let's talk a little bit about G20. And of course, as I think, Velina, you mentioned just now, recently, India handed over the baton to Brazil. But over the past 12 months, there's been a flurry of activities, one might say, going on in India and around India. G20, I was also part of it through the Think 20 process. And I think it's fair to say that I think India was probably the country in recent history, if not ever, that made the most splash out of it in terms of not just having a series of expert or political consultations, but also really trying to make this an endeavor where the entire country would somehow take place, with all sorts of conferences and gatherings happening all over India. What do you think, Gopal? Is that something that independently of the concrete outcomes of the summits and so on, is that something that helped India a lot to gain stature on the global stage? Is that something that will endure, kind of a legacy that will endure this 1-year mandate as president of the G20?
Yeah, Matthias, I do think there, like you rightly point out, this was as some have commented, this was kind of a democratization of the G20 because of the sheer, connection that, the G20 Secretariat of India tried to forge with the Indian people. So when folks talk about foreign policy for the middle class or foreign policy for people, this is kind of an example of that, I think. In terms of concrete outcomes, I think there were a few, and there are some in the area of climate that'll continue beyond the lifetime of this G20 presidency. There are some in a few other areas like digitization, like AI, like crypto. So when we talk about climate, for instance, there were quite a few, and there was a virtual G20 leaders summit that concluded just last week, I believe. And in that, a lot of the continuing work streams were reviewed. A few of them are feeding into COP28 as well. And so the hope is that they will build towards COP28 outcomes, including a special committee on green hydrogen, including the Global Alliance for Biofuels, a few other, there were some productive talks about climate financing as well. And so the idea or the hope is that these continue into COP28 and beyond. And so they to your point, they survive and they thrive beyond the lifetime of the G20 presidency. Similarly, when it comes to digitization, India arguably is, some have said that digitization might be, or universal payment, unified payments interface, UPI, as we call it, through digitized platforms is arguably one of India's superpowers, in that India has done it really well and has brought digital payments, cashless payments to the masses, and thereby achieved financial inclusion of hundreds of millions of people. And so, the world multilateral development bodies like the World Bank, like ADB, have been studying India's model and are thinking of ways to take it to other countries as well in the global south and beyond. So that too is another example of an outcome from this G20 that could continue. There are regulations. There were principles on AI regulation. There was a discussion about crypto regulation. Those two are continuing. So just to give you these examples, and I'll pause here, but there do seem to be outcomes that will continue.
Velina, when we look at the way India handled the G20 presidency, and you're right to point out some of the legacies on the content side, and I think even the mere fact that there was a final joint declaration at the end of the summit was considered a major feat for the Indian presidency, because of course, given the global situation, that was not assured on the outset. But in the way that India conducted itself, or the Indian government, during the presidency, I think there were two major pillars. One was that yes, we are a global player. We're now the largest country in the world, so we demand and we expect to be treated as a world power on that stage. But the second was that I believe India tried to present itself as, if not the leader of the global south, whatever that global south is, we could discuss this as well, but as the voice. And I think this has been repeatedly said by the Prime Minister, by the Foreign Minister, is that we want to give the global south a voice. Do you think that is something that they have succeeded in? And is that the role for India going forward, the voice of the global south?
Yes, my short answer to both questions is actually yes. First and foremost, because India succeeded in getting the African Union into G20. That means that the African Union is going to be the second institutional actor next to the European Union as a member of G20, and this is India's success. So that means, of course, that India clearly highlights its interest in being an advocate of the, let's say, collective global South, including countries from Latin America, Africa, and the Asian continent, or if you like, the rest of 7 billion people around the world, whose interests are still underrepresented because most of the countries from these continents are not equally represented at global, at regional arenas. So G20 being this format that emerged after the global financial crisis is actually a format for agendas centered around development, but also centered around representation of, let's say, this exact global South. And here, of course, I will argue that India has achieved an immense success. Second important success, in my view, when we talk about the geopolitical, of course, the geopolitical ramifications and those that are linked to the geopolitics, namely when it comes to geoeconomics, was the announcement of IMEC, which was meant to be a corridor between India, the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel, and the European Union. And you know very well that right now we are in this transformational period of international relations, where it's really about also competition among transport, digital, and energy corridors, with China leading the way with its Silk roads. This is the Belt and Road, so to say, strategy, reaching out to 3 continents meanwhile. And we know also that the European Union announced a similar project with the Global Gateway. So in a sense, this IMEC corridor would have been a very, very good third way of actually facilitating digital energy transport corridors connecting the European continent with India via third countries, including African also, and the Middle Eastern countries. And here, why I say would have been is, of course, 9th of October events and conflict between Hamas and Israel, which of course will put the region into a very different geopolitical context, at least for a year or more, but still I argue that it has been a very big success. And third important point I would like to highlight is the importance of multilateralism. Now we have India actually propagating very similar agenda as the one of Germany and by extension the European Union, and that is actually the agenda of strong multilateral institutions and organizations. G20 is one of many to be considered, but here we have, of course, the need for reforms within the UN Security Council, and again, Germany and India are on the same page when it comes to restructuring the UN Security Council, which has been, by the way, pretty much blocked since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and meanwhile also with the ongoing military conflict between Israel and Hamas. And think of the possible third front which could happen in South China Sea, and for instance with the now satellite transfer technology transfer to North Korea. There you go. Once again, I think that this was a very, very big success.
Interesting to see what will happen with that announcement. Indeed, I agree. You know, the announcement made a bit of a splash, and then nothing much was heard about it. In part, of course, due to the fact that the conflict in the Middle East erupted again with the terrorist attacks in October. Now, let's get back very briefly to Africa and this idea of India, you know, giving the global South a voice. Kasturi, in your view, do you think that will also help India economically or just politically? And I'm asking that question because, of course, we all know that China has been very active in Africa, among other regions, for many times, for a long time. Is that something that might also be a way that India could go, is benefiting from those connections, not just politically, but also economically?
I was thinking about it, and I mean, well, everybody knows that China has been active in Africa, but it's also important to highlight that India has also not been less active in the entire African continent. And there we've seen businesses. We've also we see an extremely affluent Indian diaspora in Africa due to colonial and in post-colonial times. So there is a shared history there. Secondly, there is a lot of potential in the African continent. And I think we're using Africa as a very loose term, but Africa itself is quite a diverse, heterogeneous kind of mass of countries. However, there are strong connections with countries, be it like Ethiopia, South Africa, Kenya, let's say, amongst others, where India has played a very significant role when it comes to either natural resources, manufacturing, which are also kind of shared areas or shared sectors with the EU. But there, I think politically, of course, India being the voice, let's say, of the global South and projecting the African Union as part of G20, one speaks of India kind of also being as, I mean, take this very positively, big brother, where, you know, we need to look after everybody. It's our shared responsibility. But on the other side, I think India will definitely benefit economically with this cooperation. And I think my co-panelists would also agree to that sentiment. So yes, I mean, the clear answer is yes, politically as well as economically. So.
And if I may chime in as well, completely agree, Kasturi. And in fact, I would argue that the strongest relationships can be built not just through alignment politically, but also economically. Also people-to-people exchanges and so on. So fully agree with you there. And I think adding to your point, you know, there's certainly economic potential for India through engagement with African countries. And the question is, you know, also making sure there's economic benefit for African countries themselves. That, you know, we are all in the same boat in terms of trying to develop our economies, create jobs, uplift people out of poverty into the middle class, grow our per capita incomes, and so on. So it'll have to be a win-win. And I think that's probably what was missing more on the, you know, in some of the offerings that China had made. So the question is, are there alternatives to be determined?
But I also want to add one more point, and you know, especially in the EU, we see so much. We see a political rise among the far right political parties. And I think while we are all talking of shared cooperation and collaboration, the political agenda or the message seems quite different, at least in the EU. I don't know if you've been following the elections in the Netherlands. And there I see all the more the reason and the energy that needs to be divested in such collaborative activities, because that is really the way forward. And while we cannot depend on a single partner or a single economic force, and we're speaking of decoupling, decentralization, etc., but to be able to decentralize, you need to have, you know, your eggs in more than one basket. And they're trying to kind of, you know, I will look to my own home and I will look to my own little country is not going to go well going forward. So I would just like to add that in, because we see a lot of political debate here in the EU with the increasing popularity in the far right parties. So that would have an impact, but that shouldn't have an impact on the economic relationships.
Good. We're almost getting to the end, and I would like to spend the remaining minutes that we have to look a little bit ahead. So we've looked back on what happened this year, but obviously there's also 2024 coming. Things are continuing to move and to evolve. And I want to start this off with a question that we got from our audience, from Felix Giesmann. And he asks, in fact, about the future, Germany and India. I'll read it to you. What do you think about Germany and India's future as partners? And he also adds, will they be negatively affected by India's democratic backsliding? Gopal, what do you think? What's your take on that?
I have to say, I'm not a political scientist, so I may struggle to answer this, but I'll do my best. For me, I struggle with what democratic backsliding means in the first place. I'm not sure about the definition that you know, Felix might have in mind, because, you know, in terms of access of information, in terms of people's participation, through, social media or other means in terms of access to, financial inclusion programs, other benefits in terms of upward mobility. I mean, India is not doing too badly. And so I honestly am struggling with just the definition. It may not, perhaps it doesn't align completely with how Europe looks at democracy. But I think even within Europe, you have variations of how democracy is conducted. So I'll excuse myself at that point.
I
So
would
you
just
wanna-
like
yeah.
to add to what Gopal said. And yes, I'm also struggling with this concept of democratic backsliding. And I think a large part of the news that we read about India and Germany is, I'm sorry to say, pretty negative. And what the media plays a big role in the perception of a country in another country. And I think that is probably kind of reflecting in Felix's question, where India kind of sometimes is projected as a radical far right, having a radical far right government in power, and not doing so much for the alleviation of poverty, etc. And I struggle there as well, because I think it is often very falsely projected. I have a feeling that India has much more potential than actually is shown outside. And therefore, I would actually not agree with Felix's question, because I do not see India as a democratic backsliding country. So just to reiterate what you're saying, Gopal, but also kind of highlighting the role of media and why it is so important to actually, I would actually suggest Felix to go and travel to India and actually see it for himself, what's happening there. So.
Good, thank you. Now, independently of how your view is, whether there is a democratic backsliding or not, one thing that is clear, there will be elections next year in India, and I think it's also fair to assume that anything else than a re-election of the current government would be a big surprise. So I think we can expect at least stability in that respect politically. Now, let's do a quick final round, and I would like to start with Velina. If you look ahead at 2024 Indo-German relations, what do you think are the most important topics that will be on the agenda?
Thank you very much. So first and foremost, FTA, of course, negotiations do not need another 10 years period. So the faster, the better. This is the motto. And it will be beneficial for both Germany and India. Second important point that we did not have time to discuss is defense sector. So as we are now currently in a period of Zeitenwende in Germany, I would argue that actually what we will see is also more happening in the field of defense, cyber, digitalization, obviously. This is also something that India can offer, but at the same time, what Germany can offer, and by extension, the European Union is, of course, a lot happening in the climate-related sectors, green transition. These are capabilities and capacities that can be actually offered to the Indian sectors. We will see a lot of political dynamics. The biggest risk I see is if there is a eruption of another military, let's say, military activities between China and India. This is problematic, as we see that Europe in general and Germany as well are struggling to, of course, shape this de-risking approach to China. This is the biggest risk. And the second biggest risk to the relationship in general is, of course, if there are some terrorist-related activities on Indian soil. Final point, free and open Indo-Pacific. We tend to forget in Europe that most of the trade is actually conducted via maritime routes, and that Europe also needs to contribute to this, free and open Indo-Pacific. That means becoming a security provider. Here I see that Germany is going to increase its role, and this will have positive a positive impact on also German companies. And we should not forget also the possibility from European point that triangle relations will be used. That means India can offer also an access to, it was already discussed, African, for instance, markets, but also Asian markets for German companies through a trilateral relationship.
Thank you. Gopal, what do you think? What will be on the agenda for Indo-German relations in 2024?
Fully agree with Velina about FTA, about defense cooperation, and more. A couple of other sectors that could be of promise, green and sustainable sectors. So everything from renewables to green hydrogen to electric vehicles, e-mobility. There could be quite a bit of scope for business-to-business partnerships there and investment flows either way. I was actually, by the way, really happy to learn from Kasturi about investment flows from India to Germany. I actually wasn't so aware. So thank you for that, Kasturi. So there are some of these kinds of sectors that show quite a bit of promise as well, and hopefully are explored more fully in 2024. The final thing is, going back to my earlier point, companies going in either direction, having some support from people who understand the local context really well and who can guide them. And so, folks like Kasturi in Germany playing a role in that facilitating role, and similar folks in India, I think can really help facilitate new entrants to either market, to understand the local context, to understand the regulations that impact their business models, how to, if needed, adapt business models to local context, and then the nitty-gritty of actually setting up shop here. And so, so hopefully we see a lot more traction in 2024. And finally, I have to say forums like this, I think are great. Because again, when we talk about people-to-people exchanges and trying to understand one another, having these kinds of discussions is great and incredibly valuable. So my compliments for organizing this.
Thank you very much. And finally, Kasturi, so what are your expectations and maybe also your wishes for 2024?
Well, more work for me.
Okay, we'll try to make that happen.
I mean, I think that the high-level structures, the political mandate is already there. So it's really more for agencies like ours, but not just our agencies, associations, industry associations, be it in Germany, EU, India, really need to come together more often in 2024, hopefully with mobility being a little more easy than it was in the last couple of years, that this can be facilitated with ease. And finally, I think that this should go on, even if it's very modest, that there should be no stop. There should be nothing, as Velina said, nothing untoward that can hamper or hinder this progress. Both the countries are, as the Indian Prime Minister said, they're like big, long trains. And if you want to change the track of a train, it's going to take a really long time. However, I wish that India becomes also the ICE that Germans have, and the German ICEs also function better next year. So yeah, more cooperation, more collaboration, and hopefully more to do for all of us going forward. So that would be my last word. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Oh, one more thing for 2024, more German pensioners in Goa, please.
Okay. Noted.
Why just pensioners, Gopal? I don't mind.
No, everybody.
More time. I don't mind spending more time in Goa. It's 0 degrees outside, so
it's very cold here. We had snow the past couple of days here in Frankfurt. So yes, thank you very much. We've talked about a lot of topics, as is natural, I think, in a year review, and we talked about big global macro things that where we're facing a dynamic world. But again, most of the things that we've discussed seem to lend themselves to more Indo-German or Indo-European cooperation, which I think is a good thing. We've also found out that the devil lies in the details. So sometimes it's about information sharing, facilitating knowledge mutually, and that obviously is one of the roles that we have for ourselves with the center. So we're happy to continue in that path. Thank you very much, first of all, to my 3 panelists here for this engaging, very interesting discussion. Thank you, obviously, also to our viewers, as always, also for your questions and for contributing with answers. As I said before, this is the last session that we have for 2023. So I wish all of you a very happy holidays, end of year celebrations, vacations, whatever you have planned. And we will be back with this format in January with a new topic. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.